안녕하세요. 9월 21일 수요일 드디어 결전의 날이 왔습니다. 좀 이따가 시작을 하려고 했는데 그냥 일찍 멤버 라이브 끝나고 어, 그냥 좀 먼저 워밍업을 하면 좋을 것 같아서 일찍 켰습니다. 오늘 시장 아침의 움직임은 뭐 예상했던 대로예요. 그렇게 크게 강하게 움직일 그럴 것도 없고요. 그냥 살살 눈치를 보면서 기회를 기다리는 그런 모습이 아닌가 그렇게 보입니다. 뭐 시장에 큰 변동성도 없고요. 움직임도 뭐 지금 이 차트에 보시면은 비합선에서 오르락 내리락 하는 그런 분위기로 지금 눈치를 보는 분위기고, 지금 이 화면에는 제가 일단은 나스닥 선물 차트랑 CNBC 뉴스 페이지만 이렇게 걸어놨어요. 이렇게 보시면 될 것 같고요. 그리고 일단은 기다려 보자고요. 이제 보통 시작하기 전에, 그러니까 11시에 발표하니까 이제 딱 30분 정도 남았는데요. 30분 전쯤에 이제 시장이 뭐 좀 찍기를 좀 할 것 같아요. 어떤 방향으로 갈지. 그래서 오르락 내리락 좀 할 수도 있어요. 하지만 완전한 결과가 나오고 그 다음에 기자회견이 있을 때까지는 마켓의 방향 어떻게 될지 아무도 모르죠. 그래서 한 30분 동안 여러분들이랑 좀 뭐 채팅을 하든지 그러면서 보내도록 하겠습니다. 일단 백그라운드는 CNBC를 좀 깔아 놓겠는데요. 글쎄 뭐 제 목소리랑 겹치니까 조절하면서 보도록 하겠어요. 영킵님, 선샤인님, 어젯밤에 러시아 얘기가 갑자기 러시아에서 30만 군을 움직인다 뭐 그런 얘기가 나오면서 약간 그 선물 시장이 휘청 살짝 했었어요. 살짝 했었는데 그게 언제냐면은 아마 12시 가까이 다 됐을 거예요. 아마 요 지점에서 쉬었다가 다시 다 회복하면서 오늘은 오히려 좀 상승세, 기대감에 대한 상승세로 지금 이어지는 것 같습니다. 현재 뭐 나스닥, S&P, 다우 모두 뭐 소폭 상승을 유지하고 가는 분위기고요. 이 달러 인덱스 같은 경우에는 상당히 지금 고점이에요. 111까지 올라가 있고, 뭐 비트코인도 기대를 하는지 비트코인도 2.3% 정도 상승을 했었고, 빅스는 좀 주저앉고 있는 그런 분위기. 뭐 지금 나와 있는 이런 지표들은 아무런 의미는 없죠. 일단은 연준에서 발표를 한 후에 어떤 큰 움직임이 나올지 그 부분을 우리가 같이 기다리도록 하죠. 동학서학님도 어서 오세요.
As a Latina, it's very important to me to be proud of my heritage and be proud of who I am. We are uniquely strong and we need to be proud of that and showcase our strengths in the workplace and at home. From my own upbringing, having
이거는 뭐 주식이랑 관계없는 얘기지만 제가 드디어 어제 그 테슬라의 Full Self Driving 베타 버전을 받아서 사용을 시작했습니다. 아주 인터레스팅해요. 근데 전반적으로 그 FSD, Full Self Driving 베타 버전이 전반적으로 괜찮은데 저희 동네가 조금 트리키해요. 이렇게 업힐도 많고 그다음에 커브길도 많고 그래요. 그래서 어필에서 커브길에서 스탑 사인이 나오는 데서 조금 이상하게 움직이더라고요. 그러니까 아직 완벽하진 않더라고요. 그리고 인터섹션에서도 우리가 다운힐에서 내려가다가 신호등 있는 데가 있으면 그 거리보다 한참 뒤에 서요. 왜냐면 이게 카메라로 감지를 하니까 모르겠어요. 레벨 차이가 있고 그럴 때 조금 판단을 뭐라 그럴까 그 레벨 차가 생긴 것들을 잘 판단을 못하는 것 같기도 하고 하여튼 지속적으로 계속 사용하고 있습니다. 그러니까 어느 날은 그러니까 어제 받았으니까 제가 그래도 애들 들락날락 하면서 몇 번 왔다 갔다 하면서 사봤는데 같은 장소 같은 스피드로 가도 이게 될 때가 있고 안 될 때가 있고 그런 게 있더라고요. 오늘 아침 같은 경우에는 트래픽이 많을 때 또 신호등 앞에 가니까 또 얘가 또 막 혼란스러워하기도 하고 하여튼 재미있어요. 뭔가 이렇게 딥러닝이 되는 듯한 그런 모습을 보여주고 있기 때문에 하여튼 계속 사용해보고 업데이트를 하도록 하겠습니다. 이게 오늘 이제 30분 후에 완전히 초록색으로 바뀔 수도 있고 이제 이게 완전히 빨간색으로 바뀔 수도 있는 거죠.
All right, welcome back. And by the way, thanks to everybody across America watching, listening, maybe having a sausage boat, and I don't know.
오늘 업스타트도 올라가고 그러니까 이제 진짜로 시장은 반반이에요.
You might have heard about that. They are widely expected to raise rates.
지금 금융주 쪽에 또 전망을 좋게 보는 사람들도 있고 금융주 쪽에 전망을 나쁘게 보는 사람들도 있고 아주 반반이에요. 오늘.
And a CNBC contributor
그리고 비트코인도 그렇게 많이 오르지 않았는데 비트코인 액꼬리 중에서 마라 있죠? 마라톤 디지털 홀딩 요거는 또 오늘 7%나 올랐어요.
managed money or worked.
그리고 GIS, General Mills 같은 경우에는 오늘도 또 올랐어요. 어제도 오르고 오늘도 오르고 all time high.
What's your best advice right now?
Best advice, Brian. First, I want to know how many push-ups did Tyler do? Because I'm actually worried that I would not be able to beat him in a competition.
Like the Fed, he did 0.75 push-ups.
0.75. All right.
여러분들은 오늘 아침에 뭐 하셨어요? 아침에 혹시 뭐 미리 뭐 사놓고 막 그러진 않으셨죠?
Rate. We talked about it last week. People calling about different things. Now clients are calling asking when will equities ramp up again, and they're looking forward to maybe. I've always pointed to 2023 mid-year. I know some people think we'll have a ramp up at the end of this year, but I think a lot of this is actually on the Fed.
50 BP는 그거는 아닐 것 같은데. 50 BP는 정말 50 BP가 나오면 완전히 사람들이 더 벙쩍을 것 같아요.
Of course, you can look at the growth in large cap names that have been beaten down over the course of this year,
Such
and pick up some
as?
that you think, yes, as such as Microsoft. We've always talked about Microsoft and Apple as obviously everyone. A lot of people hold those in indexes, and everyone has a lot of people have some pure play in them. And then look at the banks; they seem to perform well, obviously in the raising rate environment. And you can look at other areas too. Dividend players.
저도 마음은 조신하게 기다리고 있는 중입니다. 아침에 그냥 템테이션이 몇 번 생겨가지고 지수가 스윙할 때 조금 들어갔다 나왔다고는 했는데 이런 날은 원래 스윙하면 안 돼요. 왜냐면 어제랑 비슷하게 움직이는 폭이 요 비합선에서 근처에서 오래 움직였거든요. 이럴 때 한번, 지금 한번 잠깐 트레이드를 하는 중이긴 한데 일단은 이거 피크 치면은 익절하고 끝내야죠.
Mostly cash. If I'm investing for my kids or 20 years from now, it's a totally different story.
100%. And timeline is a big thing. I always, point to longer, but there are people that, and I have short-term portfolios where I'm using more short-term moves. And if you look at what we've done, the mid-June low, and we usually kind of bounce after the Fed decision. There's a pullback, and in the commentary, you'll see, potentially a little bit bounce today. So you have to play your timeline. For the shorter term investors, you're probably going to bounce around that range and have resistance around 3,700. But, in the long term, for people that are investing for the long term, whether it's for their kids or for themselves, there is going to be volatility, but it could clear up in 6 to 8 months when we have more clarity on inflation potentially rolling over and maybe Fed changing course.
Yeah, but and we're talking about the Fed all day, and I get it, Delano, but you might have hopefully caught the top of the show. I mean, Vladimir Putin is talking about like tripling the number of soldiers in Ukraine. He's talking about nuclear war. He's talking about fighting to the death. Hopefully somebody's just going to take him out, if you know what I mean. But I'm just worried about the world right now. And so, it's not, the Fed is one thing, a ground war in Europe may be a whole different thing.
100%. And for us, for investors, last 2 or 3 years, you've had a litany of things. We had obviously supply chain issues. We have geopolitical issues. So we've seen the gambit. And I think what you have to point to is we've hopefully stronger management with strong execution has been able to see these things and make adjustments, right? Similar to a play in football, halftime adjustment.
이게 100bp 올라가면은 그것도 시장이 미칠 거예요. 75 베이시스 포인트가 나오면 그냥 시장이 알아서 움직여줄 텐데 그게 좋은지 나쁜지 파악은 안 되겠죠. 지금 요번에 가장 중요한 거는 이 점도표가 어떻게 되느냐. 그게 가장 중요할 것 같아요. 이 향후 2023년, 2024년 그 이후에 이 실질 기준 금리가 이렇게 하락세로 갈 것인가 아니면 더 올라가서 이렇게 될 것인가 뭐 이런 것들에 대한 좀 큰 빅픽처가 요번에는 시장에 미치는 영향이 클 것 같아요. 단순히 요번에 나오는 게 100이냐 75냐 50이냐 그거보다는 향후 어떤 식으로 크게 시장에 변동을 줄 것인가 그게 중요할 것 같아요. 그리고 지금은 이제 오늘 2년물이 4%가 넘어갔어요. 어제도 그랬지만. 그래서 보면은 안전자산이 훨씬 더 매력을 느끼게 만들어지는 그런 기점에 와 있기 때문에 굳이 돈이 많은 사람들 있죠. 돈이 많은 사람. 1년에 그냥 4% 이자만 받아도 몇 밀리언이 나올 수 있는 그 정도의 돈이 많은 사람들은 지금 같은 경우에는 단기 국채, 2년물 국채 이런 데다가 2년 동안 투자해 놓는 게 훨씬 더 안정적인 수입이 됐다. 그렇게 볼 수 있는 그런 시장의 상황이기 때문에 지금 마켓 센티멘트가 상당히 중요한 그런 타이밍이라고 보시면 될 것 같아요. 근데 여러분들이 아셔야 되는 게 이 번드, 채권을 사는 거랑 채권 ETF를 사는 거랑은 완전히 성격이 달라요. 채권 ETF라는 거는 일드를 따라가는 거잖아요. 그러니까 채권 금리도 시시각각으로 바뀌는 거잖아요. 거기에 따라 가지고 채권 금리 ETF는 움직입니다. 하지만 이제 채권을 사놓으면 사는 날부터 그냥 받는 이자가 개런티가 되죠. 그리고 나중에 채권을 대파할 때 만약에 채권이 좀 더 가치가 올라가면 그렇죠? 그러면 거기에서 또 차액도 실현을 할 수 있는 거고. 그래서 하여튼 지금 시장은 이런 위험자산보다는 안전자산 쪽으로 가는 데 있어서 상당한 매력도가 생기기 시작하는 그런 기점이다. 이렇게 보시면 될 것 같아요. 월가 쪽에서 월가 쪽을 또 아시나 보네요. 권은주님은 월가 쪽에서는 요번에 4.25까지만 가도 좋겠다 그렇게 얘기를 한다 이거죠. 한번 봅시다. 하여튼 오늘 여기에 어떻게 가는지를 한번 지켜보도록 해요. 지난번에는 4.15, 3.875 그 사이가 고점이었죠. 평균점은 3.625 뭐 이런 식으로 됐으니까. 이제 16분 남았네요. 16분. 16분 남았는데 지금 같이 시청해 주신 분은 371분, 좋아요 누르신 분은 그거에 반도 안 됩니다. 지금 아무것도 할 거 없고 심심하실 때 싫지 않으면 좋아요를 한번 눌러주시면 감사하겠습니다.
sort of see the SCP as the floor, the minimum, right, level of rates, with risks probably skewed to the upside. So I expect the median dot for next year to basically move in line with the market, come in about 440, which is what was implied by the forward curve late last week. And I would say the risks are still that they'll have to continue to revise them higher.
How much higher could they go before the economy buckles, which I think is what they want to a point? I mean, it's the only way you're going to bring down inflation is by slowing down demand, right?
오늘은 그냥 바이든이 신난 날이에요. 이 할아버지가 오늘 하고 싶은 말 다 하고 살았던 그런 날이었어요. 오늘 유엔 연설도 하고 유엔 연설하면서 아마 정치적으로 하고 싶은 얘기 다 했던 것 같아요. 오늘 아침에. 이 아리클 찾아보는데 좀 시간이 걸리니까 찾아보진 않을 건데 이 푸틴이 그런 얘기도 했어요. 지금 그거 뭐죠? 뉴클리어 웨폰 쓰는 것도 자기 장난하는 거 아니다. 블러핑 아니다. 위협하고 그러려고 하는 소리가 아니다. 자기 아주 시리어스하다 그런 얘기도 했어요. 그러니까 그런데 이게 전체적인 미국 시장은 그런 뉴스 내용을 좀 무시하는 듯한 그런 느낌이 듭니다. 아무래도 연준의 이 발표가 러시아의 유크레인 전쟁에 대한 내용보다는 비중이 크다. 그쵸? 당연하죠. 남의 집 일에 무슨 신경 쓸 거 있어요. 솔직히 우리 집 말 잘 신경 써놓으면 되는 거지.
So the last statement started with a pretty downbeat sentence which said employment and production have softened. I think they have to upgrade that because the fact is that since the last statement things have actually gotten better. Growth momentum has picked up. Even sentiment
100pp 하면 하락인가요? 초보 질문이긴 한데요. 기대했던 것보다 이자율을 많이 올리면은 성장주들 그런 거에 실적에 영향이 있겠죠. 그러면은 주가가 떨어지겠죠. 슈퍼 플래시 원님.
there's a good chance that they take out the reference to energy prices, pressuring inflation higher. And I actually think that they might acknowledge that inflation now is largely demand driven as opposed to supply chain driven. You know, I think that if you look at
근데 어쨌거나 저쨌거나 궁극적으로 미국 본토에서만 전쟁이 안 나면은 미국에서는 뭐 손해 볼 일이 없어요.
and this assumption that a lot of economists have been making that supply chain pressures are easing and inflation is going to ease, retailers are still raising prices aggressively simply because they can because consumer demand is too strong.
Netta Markowska, really appreciate your views. We'll let you get ready. If you see that Rich Handler guy walking around, just tell him to get to work. Thank you, Netta. All right, still ahead. Diamond, Frazier, and Moynihan. CEO.
이번 2022년이 참 여러 사람을 훈련시켜 준 것 같아요. 저도 그렇고 그냥 뭐 오늘같이 이렇게 뭐 발표하고 그러는 날 뭐 기대도 없고 예측도 없고 그래요. 이제는 그냥 나오면 나오나 보다 그런 느낌. 일단은 이제 발표하기 한 13분 전 시장은 일단은 긍정적으로 좀 기대를 하는 듯한 그런 차트의 움직임은 보이죠. 근데 뭐 이게 어느 순간 갑자기 그냥 장대 음봉으로 팍 바뀔 수도 있는 거고요. 장대 양봉으로 팍 솟구칠 수도 있는 거고 그거에 대해서는 아무도 장담할 수가 없습니다. 그리고 이제 지난번 우리가 다 경험해봤겠지만 이 그 연준의 리포트가 나오고 또 나온 후에 또 뭐가 있죠? 그 기자회견을 하잖아요. 또 기자회견 할 때 또 바뀌어요. 그렇기 때문에 11시부터 11시 한 30, 거의 11시부터 12시까지는 오르락 내리락 할 가능성이 높다. 그렇게 봐야 돼요. 지금 같은 경우에는. 예, 이제는 진짜 뭐 오늘 100이냐 70이냐 50이냐 그거보다는 아까도 말씀드렸지만 그 연말 내지는 앞으로 그 연준에서 최종 마지막으로 올리는 그런 최종 기준 금리가 어디까지 가느냐 그게 더 중요할 것 같아요. 그리고 그거를 얼마나 길게 유지할 것이냐 그런 게 되게 중요할 것 같습니다. 미국은 원래 손 안 대고 코 푸는 나라죠. 특히 민주당이나 부시 같은 그런 전쟁광들이 정권을 잡고 있을 때는 남 시켜가지고 정권 엎고 남 시켜가지고 전쟁 일으키고 그래가지고 나중에 돈을 쑥 걷어가는 그런 장사를 하는 얍삽한 그런 정치를 하죠.
Welcome back. The CEOs of 7 major banks testifying in front of the House Financial Services Committee today.
그리고 오늘 또 그 메이저 뱅크들 CEO들이 하우스 그러니까 하원에 청문회를 했어요. 그래서 그 내용도 뭐 내용은 너무 장황해서 좀 뭐라고 이야기가 좀 어렵긴 한데 하여튼 뭐 그렇게 모르겠어요. 그냥 뭐 지금 이런 뭐 경제 어떻게 돌아가냐 경제 얘기들 계속 했던 것 같은데 별로 그렇게 즐거운 그런 웃음 짓는 그런 내용은 아니었던 것 같아요. 바이든 지지율이 왜 오르고 있을까요? 그게 진짜로 참 한심합니다. 지금 바이든이 지지율이 오르니까 아주 그냥 탄력받았어요. 완전히 뭐 다 된 것처럼 지금 완전히 고삐 풀린 망아지처럼 망아지는 아니죠. 하고 싶은 얘기 다 하고 살아요 지금.
And JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon gave his updated take on the state of the U.S. economy, saying we're, quote, paying the price of too much fiscal monetary stimulus.
I think the sooner that the Federal Reserve gets the hand around inflation, they avoid
만약에 시장도 안 좋고 중간 선거도 민주당이 이기고 그러면은 주식 같은 것도 좀 지혜롭게 어떻게 해야 될지 여러분들이 전략을 잘 세우셔야 돼요. 일단 민주당은 자산의 가치를 많이 내리려고 하는 게 전반적인 정책이기 때문에 아시죠? 사회주의, 공산주의, 자산재분배, 부의재분배 그런 거를 하기 때문에 여러분들 조심하셔야 된다고 생각됩니다.
Representative capital requirements erode banks' ability to meet customer needs. Brian.
I mean, the comments 150 on oil, global recession. I mean, he doesn't mince words, Diamond.
No, he did earlier speak to kind of the chance of
이제 7분이나 남았습니다.
soft landing, while also noting there's a chance that we have some sort of mild recession and a chance we have a more severe recession. He didn't know.
예, 제 오피스가 이게 가라지 오피스라 바로 옆에 빨래 세탁기가 있어요. 지금 제가 그걸 또 해야 되는 그런 입장이기 때문에 지금 다 됐나 보네요.
For me.
You better hurry.
Good grief. Thank you. All right. Folks, that does it for us here on the exchange. Power Lunch at CNBC picking up the
그럼 이왕 들킨 거 드라이어에 좀 넣고 오겠습니다. 개인주택 살죠. 어쨌거나 지금 빨래를 해야 되는 이유는 미국은 아침 전기가 쌉니다. 아침 8시부터 오후 4시까지 전기가 가장 쌉니다. 1kWh당 33센트. 그 시간이 지나가면은 40센트. 그렇게 됩니다. 이제 5분 남짓 남았습니다. 아주 그 폭풍전야 같은 그런 느낌이죠.
All right, welcome everybody to Power Lunch. I'm Tyler Matheson along with Seema Modi. We are just minutes away from the release of the Fed decision on
일단 CNBC 볼륨을 좀 올릴게요.
its third straight 3/4 of a percentage point hike to fight inflation.
We are watching the markets very closely. Stocks ahead of the decision are losing steam. The Dow is currently up about 152 points. S&P 500 rising 25. Nasdaq Composite is still holding on to a gain of 0.7%. The bond market clearly in focus. The yield on the 10-year Treasury note touching 4%.
We got about 4 minutes.
10year도 4% 뭐야? 10year? 뭐 10year 4%야? 아닌데. 10year은 3.5.
Katie Nixon, Chief Investment Officer at Northern Trust Wealth Management, and Jim Caron, Global Fixed Income Portfolio Manager at Morgan Stanley Investment Management. Got a lot of brain power here. David Kelly, I remember when we began this cycle.
이제 결과가 중요한 게 아니라 평가가 중요한 거기 때문에.
Typical problem with Fed policy is that
그렇죠. 결론보다는 이게 결정도 중요하지만 시장에서 받아들이는 그런 센티멘트가 중요한 거기 때문에 그 부분을 어떻게 해석하느냐가 진짜로 시장에서 중요할 것 같아요. 지금 선물 지수 같은 경우에 이제 계속 일단은 올라가 보자 이거죠. 일단 올라가 보자. 팔면 되니까. 일 1분 30초 남았습니다. 어느 사이트를 봐야지 제일 빨리 나올까? CNBC 보는 게 제일 빠르겠죠? 지금 CNBC에서 모여놓은 이 패널들도 한 75 베이시스 포인트를 올릴 거라고 예상하는 게 크네요. 지금 2년물은 거의 4% 치고 있고
So you've got this inversion, you've got this problem in the yield curve that's reflecting a lot of uncertainty about the economic outlook. So we're going to have to deal with that next year.
Jim, I'm going to come back to you because David is worried that the Fed may go too far and stay there too long and really damage the economy.
동학상님은 올해 좋은 데 사시네요. 더운 물도 나오고. 여기에도 그렇게 설치할 수 있는데 돈이 많이 들어요, 미국은. 저는 태양광은 있는데 태양광 전기 만드는 게 너무 양이 지붕에 거의 다 깔았는데도 여름에 그러니까 5, 6, 7, 8, 9까지는 많이 전력을 생산하고 그 다음에 10월 속구치네. 왜 속구쳐? 나왔나봐요. 팍 떨어지네요 지금. 올랐다 떨어졌다. 여기는 엄청나게 지금 변동성이 있을 거예요. 내용이 중요해요 이제. 75 베이시스 포인트 올렸고요. 시장은 별로 좋아하지 않네요. 예, 시장은 좋아하지 않는 것 같아요.
Meeting here. For 2023, the median forecast is for a 4.6% funds rate. Again, a bit higher on the peak rate than where the market was, and that was from 3.8. For 2024, the median forecast is 3.9 from 3.4. 10 members do see a number below that 3.9 level, so if you want to think about the Federal Reserve cutting rates, that looks like it's going to happen sometime in 2024, getting back down to the new number we have for 2025, and that is 3.9%. A sharply lower GDP outlook, just 0.2% forecast for this year.
지금 2이얼은 4%가 넘어가 버렸습니다.
23 down from 1.7, and then gradually the Fed sees the economic growth getting back towards the trend of 1.8%. A big but not tremendous increase in the unemployment rate outlook, 4.4 for 2023 from 3.9, so almost a percentage point or more higher than.
지금 페드 펀드 레이트는 3.3에서 3.25%로 됐고, 지금 이게 다 이제 쿡 떨어뜨렸다가 이제 또 이제 치고 올라올 수도 있어요. 지금 뭐 막 사고 팔고 하는 것보다 조금 분위기를 파악하는 게 더 지혜로울 수 있습니다.
The committee remains on track for that $95 billion reduction in the balance sheet, and the decision was unanimous, with, I believe, the first time we've had 19 members of the Federal Reserve with a full Federal Reserve governor for maybe almost a decade. Tyler, back to you.
Steve, thank you. Let's bring in the panel now. Bob Pisani from the New York Stock Exchange, Rick Santelli also joining us. And Rick,
점도표를 한번 볼게요. 점도표 어떻게 나왔나? 점도표는 아직 업데이트 안 되네요. 지금 페드워치 업데이트 안 되고.
Yes, I'm watching all the different maturities on the yield curve, and one thing I can tell you is right before the Fed announcement, rates were virtually unchanged. We're now up 13, 14 basis points on the session on a 2-year. The high yield on a 2-year now 4.11, 4.11, 4.11, like we used to call information. And on the 10-year, the high yield thus far on this move, 3.62%. Fed fund futures, and there's so many contracts. I'm looking at the January. It dropped like a rock down towards 95.66 when its prices.
지금 세 번에 걸쳐 가지고 이제 75 베이시스 포인트를 올린 거잖아요. 지금 3에서 3.25 정도를 유지할 것으로 보이는 거고.
Ultimately, another dynamic was prevalent right before the announcement. 30-year and 10-year yields were on top of each other. It actually inverted briefly. That's a very unusual inversion because 30s to 10s, known as the knob spread, since 2006 has only had 2 sessions, and they were both this year where they closed inverted. Want to pay attention there. And
아직 피벗에 대한 얘기는 없는 것 같고 2023년에 4.6% 정도 그 정도 금리 정책을 유지한다. 이제 그런 얘기. 그리고 또 뭐가 있나요? 뭐 이자율 때문에 담보 많이 생기고 뭐 그런 얘기들 많이 한 것 같고.
Yeah, and I watched the S&P. We were at 3880 or so, and we've dropped about 40 points or so since then. And it's very obviously why. This is what the market didn't want, the higher for longer scenario here. So we have a higher Fed funds projected rate for 2022. We have a higher Fed funds projected rate for 2023. No reductions until 2024. Not quite priced into the market, so very understandably why the market has moved down here. So we know why Powell's been so aggressive here. The stock market's rallied.
지금 상당히 호키시하게 발표를 한 것 같아요. 이제 연준 의장 나오는 시간에 연설을 좀 들어야 될 것 같아요. 그리고 채권 그 MBS 같은 것도 계속 지금 늘려간다 그런 얘기도 하고 있고요.
Obviously, it's now higher than people had thought earlier. And when this concerns about over-tightening really start to kick in, that's what they want to hear at the presser. So I think the problem for the presser now is Powell's going to maintain maximum flexibility. He's going to not give any hints about the next rate hike. Obviously, there's implications it's going to be potentially 75 basis points. And he's certainly going to push back against any pivot next year. For the market here, remember, we're about 5% above where we were at the market lows on June 16th. That's 36.66 or so. And is there anything at the press conference that might sound a little less hawkish? I think if he would acknowledge somehow that
이제 뭐 또 기자회견 할 때 논조가 바뀔 수도 있으니까.
cuts they already have some indication that they're aware at least of the slowdown. And remember, Powell is winning on a lot of fronts here. Housing is definitely softening. We saw that this morning with the data. Commodities are softening and wages are not. So it's a very tough picture. Anything, I think, bottom line here is for the presser, anything that indicates they are still data dependent.
저는 일단 트레이딩 포지션 다 덜어냈어요. 일단 테슬라 트레이딩 포지션이 있었는데 수익 딱 지금 수익률 나오는 부분에서 다 정리하고 연준 회장 발표 기자회견 할 때까지는 기다려봐야 될 것 같아요. 다시 들어가면 되니까.
What does that tell you about how the Fed sees inflation leveling off? If it will level off in the early months.
I think they just want to sound hawkish. I mean, I'm trying to figure out what I'm supposed to be so scared about here. If you look at their projections, they think that inflation will come steadily down. Now, it might take a little while to get to 2%, but honestly, has anybody's life changed between 2 and 3%? I get it that 9% inflation is absolutely intolerable, but those days, I think, are already behind us. And meanwhile, what I think is really interesting.
혹시 또 내용 업데이트된 거 있나 볼게요.
They built in 75.
제 생각엔 일단은 이게 단 것 같아요. 기자회견 나오고 보면 지금 연말까지 터미널 레이시 4.6% 2023년 피벗 같은 얘기는 없는 것 같아요. 그리고 여기 보면은 다플러스에서 봤을 때는 지금 2024년까지는 레이 컷이 없을 것 같다. 이제 그렇게 여기 표현을 하고 있네요.
That's very interesting, and that metaphor is certainly a frightening one. Certainly what Bob said, Ms. Nixon, is that the market is reacting to the idea that rates are going to stay higher for longer. Are you as worried as David is about what sounds like a rather more serious recession in the U.S.?
Well, I guess I would echo one of the
이 두 가지가 가장 큰 포인트인 것 같아요, 지금은. 그리고 뭐 GDP 그로스 뭐 이런 얘기하는 거는 이거는 바뀔 수 있는 부분이고. 지금 막 뭐 트레이드 하려고 그러시면은 잘못하면은 크게 물릴 수도 있어요. 조심하세요. 지금은 그냥 현상 유지하고 있는 게 제일 좋을 것 같기도 해요. 그리고 뭐 다시 올라가더라도 이제 그 뭐죠? 기자회견 나오면 또 달라질 것 같아요.
So the things I'm listening to from Powell is going to be how he links the labor market to the current Fed policy. So right now what the Fed is saying is that they can control inflation without doing too much damage to the labor market. And that is something that really the markets don't fully believe. In order to really control inflation, it's more than likely that the unemployment rate has to go up more than what the Fed is actually saying. What shouldn't be lost on anybody.
그냥 잠 주무셔도 될 것 같아요. 한국에 계신 분들은. 왜냐하면은 어차피 오늘은 이 정도 크게 움직였으면은 내일 방향성은 내일 정해질 거예요. 그러니까 내일 방향성 정해진 거에 맞추시면 될 것 같아요. 오늘 계속 이렇게 출렁출렁 할 텐데요. 뭐 기자회견 중에서도 뭐 기자의 질문에 따라 가지고 좀 트리키한 질문을 하면은 또 시장은 또 이상하게 어렵게 해석할 거고 뭐 오르락내리락 할 겁니다. 지금은 자기가 생각하는 방향 하나에 맞춰 가지고 만약에 나는 기술적 반등, 저점 매수를 노리겠다 그러시는 분이면은 저점 매수를 노리는 게 낫고, 이거는 꽝이다. 그래서 난 숏으로 가겠다. 그러면은 숏 방향으로 가서 피를 보든 수익을 얻든 정하셔야 되고, 지금 뭐 요리 갔다 저리 갔다 하다가는 양쪽에 다 털릴 수 있습니다. 지금 사실 테슬라도 잘 버티는 것 같아요. 테슬라도 지금 뉴스 나오자마자 한번 갔다가 뭐 거의 오늘 저점까지 올라왔어. 그러니까 오늘 훅 나간 저점이 아니라 오늘 그 연준 발표 전에 저점 306불 그 근처에 다시 왔어요. 전 다시 들어갔어요. 저는 아까 308에 털었다가 지금 305에 들어갔어요. 다시. 뭐 어차피 저는 테슬라는 좀 들고 가야 될 것 같아요. 손해를 보더라도 어차피 옵션으로 커버 다 해놨고 지금 뭐 풋 옵션도 있고 그렇기 때문에 테슬라는 크게 걱정하지 않아요. 전략적으로 트레이딩을 하는 거니까. 근데 이제 중요한 거는 이 지수인데 지수는 방향을 잘 잡아야지 돈을 벌 수 있잖아요. 근데 지수 방향 잡기는 좀 쉽지가 않네요. 지금은. 그냥 차트 흐름으로만 봐서는 아직 하락이죠.
And that's what investors are trying to figure out. I just want to draw our attention to the 2-year note, which is sensitive to monetary policy. Rick Santelli now above 4.4% at 4.1.
Yeah, I think that pretty much I agree with David on most issues. I think the 2-year note yields.
지금은 딱 자기가 방향을 잡으세요. 지금은 아무도 몰라요. 뭐 지금 기자회견하면서 올라갈지 내려갈지. 그러니까 자기 믿는 신념대로. 앞으로 떨어지면 얼마나 떨어지겠냐. 이제 그런 마음이 있는 거죠. 예, 앞으로 떨어져봐야 뭐 5%, 10% 더 떨어지지 뭐 그 이상 떨어지겠어요. 이제 그런 생각으로 가면 돼요. 만약에 지금 막 완전히 깨질 것 같았으면 벌써 더 확 깨졌죠. 그렇죠? 벌써 깨질 것 같았으면 와장창 깨졌죠. 지금 뭐 뉴스는 없으니까 차트 화면을 좀 크게 옮기고 볼게요. 그래서 이제 일봉으로 보고, 그렇죠? 분봉으로 보잔 말이에요. 일봉으로 봤을 때는 지금 이 부분이 지난번 저점 아닙니까? 이 부분이 저점이고 지금 추세가 내려간다 그래도 앞으로 이 저점 밑으로 내려가면 앞으로 5% 정도 내려가는 거예요. 5% 정도 더 내려가면은 뭐 끝나겠지. 이제 그 정도 보는 거죠. 그렇죠? 그러면 뭐 지금 매수를 해도 5% 차이면 상승 매수해도 오케이. 만약에 하락 매수했는데 5% 채 안 내려가고 다시 올라오면 손절하든지 익절 짧게 하든지 하고 튀고 오는 거죠. 올해 연말 금리가 아니라 2023년 터미널 여기 있었는데 터미널 레이시 4.6 여기 2023년 터미널 레이시 4.6이라는 거죠. 올해는 4.4 그러면은 지금 얼마 됐어요? 3에서 3.2 되면은 앞으로 뭐 1.5를 더 올린다는 얘기예요?
What I think they're setting up is a situation where they actually put the economy in recession, and then, much as they would deny it today, they are eventually going to reverse course.
지금 이 아저씨들이 얘기하는 거 제가 들으면서 하니까 헷갈리네요. 일단은 페드 와치.
markets in the long run.
페드와치도 지금 뭐 업데이트하라고 바쁘네요.
But for long-term investors, I actually think there is an opportunity here because eventually the Fed's going to have to turn.
얘가 지금 제일 폭주되네요.
But that's going to play out over time. It's going to take a while.
좀 기다려 보고요.
How's that for a long-term investment?
Katie, I'll give you a last, final, ultra final word.
Well, Tyler, it's real hawkish report here for sure on the part of the Fed.
하여튼 어쨌건 허키시한 거는 맞아요. 지금 상황이 허키시한 거니까 절대 도비시한 상황은 아니니까 그것만 알고 계시면 될 것 같아요.
I think investors are going to pivot from worrying about the valuation impact of higher rates to now the earnings impact of these higher rates, not just through the currency channel, but through the slower economic growth channel as well. So
오늘은 지수로 봤을 때는 요지점만 지켜주면은 하락 막을 수 있을 것 같고 이거 뚫리면은 흐름 자체는 좀 내려갈 것 같네요. 지금 요게 딱 78.6% 지난 저점과 고점 연결한 78.6% 지점에 지금 거의 도달해 와 있거든요. 아마 그 정도가 좀 지켜주지 않을까 싶어요. 제 생각에는 78.6%. 그거를 S&P로 보면은 S&P는 조금 다른 스토리인데 S&P는 여기 갭 있는 데까지 보면은 3,818 그 정도까지 그 정도까지는 일단 지켜준다 그러면 괜찮을 것 같아요. 오늘 끝. 뭐 더 더 얘기하고 썰을 풀 게 없죠. 또 팩트가 나와버렸으니까. 다른 지표들을 한번 보면은 10년물은 올랐다 내렸고 지금 2년물은 어떻게 되고 있나? 10년물 이게 리얼타임인지 모르겠어요. 여기에 나오는 게 일단 2년물은 지금 4%를 뚫어버렸네요. 그렇죠? 그렇죠. 연말까지 4%가 넘는다 그러니까 뚫릴 이유가 되죠. 여러분 더 이상 제가 필요 없을 것 같습니다. 그렇죠? 오늘 여기까지 보고 이따가 파웰의 그 기자회견 그 부분이 더 중요할 것 같으니까요. 뭐 계실 분은 계셔도 되고 안 계실 분은 지금 다시 꿈나라로 돌아가시면 될 것 같습니다. 그리고 미국에 계신 분들은 생업으로 돌아가셔도 될 것 같아요. 일단은 버텨주는 듯한 일단은 기다리자 또 싶은 그런 모습이 여기서 보이는 것 같으니까요. 저는 라이브는 켜놓고 있을게요. 라이브는 켜놓고 있고 필요한 코멘트가 있으면 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다.
Stocks are falling just a bit, well, more than just a bit right now, 272 points on the Dow, as you see there. After we've heard from the Fed, decision to raise interest rates by 3/4 of a point, yields have been spiking. The two-year yield now at its highest level since 2007. It is above 4%, as you see there, really close to 4.1%. The decision sounded a little more hawkish. As Steve Leisman put it, he out-hawked the hawks. Long-term rates above 4.25% by year-end. With us now, Frederick Mishkin, former Federal Reserve Governor. Mr. Mishkin, welcome. Good to see you. You believe that we got here because of policy mistakes made by the Federal Reserve and the fact that they had to play catch-up. Are they playing catch-up too hard right now?
No,
are they doing the right thing?
So, I've been very critical of the Fed for well over a year on CNBC, because I think they needed to do much more. And in fact, had an op-ed in the Financial Times in January saying that their policy framework was flawed. But I had a recent op-ed, and the Fed has now turned the ship around, is doing exactly what they need to be doing. That they have to be tough, that their rhetoric is now exactly where it needs to be. The good news is that inflation expectations have responded to the Fed's toughness and actually have receded somewhat, which is very good news. The problem here is that the likelihood of a recession is very high. Soft landings are just not possible or very, very unlikely in situations like this where you've made some mistakes, you've gotten behind the curve, and now you got to do catch up. And what that means is that the Fed's got to keep on being tough, and a recession is very likely to occur, and there's going to be a lot of pressure on the Fed to ease off. In fact, the markets have been thinking that once the economy starts to slow down a lot, a recession occurs, that the Fed will back off. That would be a huge mistake. And I just had an op-ed in the Financial Times about a week ago saying that people don't remember that Volcker, the tough guy Volcker, actually blinked in 1980. And as a result, the Fed had to raise rates by much more than they otherwise would have. We had an extremely severe recession.
미국
And so
보통이
the Fed
1.8이에요.
basically blinks and is not doing
GDP
what it's doing now, which is
그런데
talking
이제
tough
지난
and convincing markets that they mean
9월이
business.
아니라 준
Then
6월에
the problem will be that
예측한 것보다
they'll
조금
actually
더
have to raise
떨어졌다는
rates by
거.
more, and a more severe recession would result. So they're now actually doing the right thing. I'm now very positive about what the Fed is doing.
내년에
but they
2.8 정도 될 거를
can't,
예상을 하네요.
succumb to
그러니까
pressure. That's the deal.
Or you
내년
get,
정도면은 연준이 좀 이징해야
or
되지
you get what
않을까
happened
생각은
during those
되네요. 이거
Volcker years, the
보면은
double dip
이거 좀
recession, which is the only
살펴볼
time
필요는
we really
있겠어요.
went into that. But Seema, go ahead.
I was just going to say,
Yeah,
Fed,
that's
그림
exactly
나온
right.
거고
Oh, so I'm sorry, Seema. Go ahead.
그다음에
No, go ahead, please.
unemployment
So I think the issue here was the
비고용.
reason why they had the double dip recession was because they
이쪽은
blinked.
4% 내외로
And so the
유지하려고
Fed
하는
had
분위기인 것 같고
raised rates to
지금
very high
지수는 뭐
levels,
살짝
actually
올라갑니다.
over 15%.
거의 이제 바닥을
The
확인한 것
recession
같아요.
was actually
오늘의
sharper than they
바닥을.
expected. They then blinked and brought the
PC 아까 나온
interest rates down by over
이거
700 basis points.
점도표.
The result
점도표.
was that inflation expectations didn't drop at
점도표가
all.
여기
The markets were
있는데
not convinced the
잠깐만
Fed was serious.
화면을
And then
좀
Volcker
줄여야 돼.
really took out the baseball bat, raised rates to over 20, and basically clobbered the economy. And then we had the second recession. So that's the danger right now.
2020년 이게 제일
that,
많이
the Fed's
찍은 게 지금
talking the
와
right way. They
여기
say that,
몰렸네요. 그러면
if
대략
there's a recession, they have to do
중간점으로
what they
온다면은
have to do.
4.75.
But we haven't seen the real pressure yet when
4.75
people
정도로
are out of
보면 될
jobs.
것
So
같고
the good
그다음에
news is they're doing the right thing,
2024년에는
but they can't make the
한
kind of mistakes that
4%
were made in the
미만으로
past.
내린다. 그러니까
And I think that they
비교적
hope they won't,
금리를
and I don't think they will, but you never know.
Powell did say in
그쵸.
Jackson Hole that households should expect
2025년까지는
some
3%
level of
이상 유지가
pain
될 것
as
같아요.
rates
지금
move
분위기는.
higher. Do you think Powell will elaborate in the press conference just what that pain would look like for Americans as they look at their wallets, their 401k, they're losing
GDP
money?
얘기고.
Yeah, I don't know if he'll, because it's always tough to give people bad news.
그런 거 하나하나
and you don't want
다
to dwell on
챙겨서
the bad
읽어보면
news. It was very good that
공부가
he
됐을
said what he
거예요.
said.
GDP,
And I
PC
think the
아까
reality
나왔던
is
얘기들
that
다 차트로 나온
he's
거니까
made
다시
it clear, and
설명해서
other members of the of participants at the FOMC have also made it
펀드
clear
레이트
that the Fed actually its main job right now is to get inflation
이런
under control,
식으로
and if it
돼서
doesn't do that, it'll be much
올라갔다가
worse later. So that's the kind of thing that he
2023년
needs
한
to
중반쯤에 피크를 치고
express.
내려가는
I don't think he needs to go in
그럼
and say, we're
2023년
gonna get a lot of
피크면은
pain and we're gonna raise rates.
2023년
That's not the strategy I would
초반에는
use. I would
주가가
just say,
오르기 시작할
we gotta
가능성이
do what we gotta
있겠네요.
do,
그렇죠?
and it's the right thing to do. And
아,
that's I
지금
think
해치
what
같은 거 하지
he's going to
말아요.
communicate.
지금
And you
해치하는
think
것도
he
늦었어요.
will have, I don't know how to say this, the kind of rhetorical discipline to do what
그냥
you
오늘
are
여기까지예요.
urging him to do.
더
And that
떨어지는 게.
is to not blink rhetorically in a
지금
press
요
conference.
도표로만
Sometimes that
보면
happens. You know, you
지금
say
대략
something,
보면은
you
여기서
do something, and then you
피봇이라
kind of
그래야 되나?
nuance it a
하여튼
little
피봇이
bit.
생기잖아요.
Yeah, it
전국점.
worries me a little bit, Jay.
그게
It's not been
2023년
great on the communication
중반쯤이다.
front.
그러면 보통
It's one of the
6개월에서
things
3개월
that
정도
the people of Wall Street,
전부터
the
반영이
Wall Street
되니까
economists have not been completely happy
주가는
about
한
it in the
올
past.
연말 내지는 내년
I think I hope
초부터
he's
올라갈
learned his
가능성이
lesson.
높겠네요.
There he's just not been
요대로만
transparent enough.
평가를 분석을
Here I
한다면
think it's that he's actually been very clear lately in a very positive way.
나머지는
And he just
뭐
needs to
좀
stick to
나중에
that.
읽어보도록
I think
하고
he'll be able to do it.
That was the issue in the July meeting, right? He said eventually he will moderate
요거
the
보시고
pace at
싶으신
which
분들은 저희
rates rise and
링크
the stocks rip. The Nasdaq was up 2% during the July meeting.
올려놨으니까 링크
Here we have a
보시면
very
되고요.
different story with stocks down across the board.
Frederick
Yeah, and
Michigan.
I think the bottom line is the stock market will go down. That's not the end of the world. That's just life.
Frederick Michigan, thank you very much for your
지금
clarity.
뭐
Always a
저점
pleasure to have you
잡기가
with us.
쉽진 않을
We
거예요.
My pleasure too.
We look forward to it.
We are a few minutes away from Fed Chairman Jerome Powell's news conference, where investors will be looking for more details on the Fed's projections for short-term rates. Power lunch. We're back in 2.
일단 단기 하향 트렌드는 여기서 깨줬어요. 깨졌기 때문에 이제 올라가는 분위기로 가고, 여기서 이런 것들 있죠. 이제 수평 저항선들 탁탁탁탁 치고 올라가면 주가 회복될 수 있으리라 예측이 됩니다. 기대라 그래야 되나? 예측이라 그래야 되나? 웃기죠, 저는. 이제 마칩니다. 감사합니다 했는데 또 계속 하고 있어. 아까 바빠서 못 봤는데. 뭐 잘라요? 사람 자르는 데 있어요? 욕한 것도 아니고? 욕한 것도 아니고 주가가 내려갈 수 있다고 뭐 그런 얘기했는데도 잘라요? 좀 웃기네. 뭐 테슬라는 이제 거의 다 다시 회복됐어요. 테슬라 같은 경우에는. 정말 아무리 봐도 지금 어떻게 됐나? 핀비즈는 어떻게 됐나 한번 봅시다. 이제 뭐 알록달록하게 바뀌었네요. 반도체 쪽, 엔비디아 쪽, 필수 소비재 쪽. 애플이랑 테슬라가 플러스로 빨리 전환돼야 되는데, 기분상. 페이팔 괜찮고, 페이팔도 좀 사보고 싶어요. 워낙 밸류에이션이 지금 떨어져 있기 때문에. 지금 페드와치가 지금 되는지 한번 봅시다. 계속 아까 에러가 났는데. 오케이, 페드와치 이제 오늘은 됐고, 이제 12월 2일 날 이제 11월 2일에 연준 회의가 또 있는데, 지금 현재 2.25에서 2.5란 말이에요.
Let's get to the New York Stock
거기다가
Exchange, where Mike Santoli is watching the market reaction. Mike, we saw stocks drop as soon as we got the 75
지금 3이
basis
된 거
point rate
아닌가?
hike
3이
decision,
됐잖아요.
plus those
그쵸,
Fed
지금
fund
3이
projections,
됐으니까.
which
아니, 이게
suggest
업데이트 안 됐네.
now we have 2 more meetings left for this year.
지금
Another
75
125
베이스
basis points
포인트 올리는 게
expected before the end of the
77.8%가
year, right?
되어버렸네요, 지금.
Absolutely, Seema. So it's not too far out of the zone of what the market seemed to be positioned for, but where it did deviate, it was slightly more hawkish in terms of front-loading more rate hikes by the end of this year and then a little more next year, and essentially painting a picture of subpar growth for a few years, still inflation nagging at the edges of our consciousness, and stocks trying to figure out what happens to the economy and earnings along the way. Now, in terms of the reflex reaction, this is never the final word on what the Fed did or said or what's going to be the outlook for the next few weeks, because we have to wait for the press conference. But the S&P 500 essentially just pulled back and tested the low for the day on each of the past 3 days. The low for today is basically the same as it was over the past 3 sessions. So it's kind of
뉴스를 제가 너무 올려놨구나. 여기까지 제가 떠드는데 아무것도 못 들으셨겠네. 죄송합니다. 네. 하여튼 다음 주가 아니라 다음 연준 회의는 11월 2일 날 있고, 지금 현재로는 그때도 75 베이시스 포인트를 올린다는 그런 확률이 많이 높다, 그렇게 보입니다. 그 얘기했어요. 이렇게 되면 좋죠 지금.
Nominal GDP growth they're projecting is about 4% for the next few years. That's not awful, and so we'll see how corporate earnings can fare in an environment if that's something like what.
이제 곧 기자회견이 지루하게 시작될 겁니다. 아마 분명히 좀 쉽게 넘어가게 하는 기자들도 있을 반면에 아주 피곤하게 질문하는 기자들도 있을 거예요. 이제 퍼웰이 어떻게 거기에 대응을 하느냐에 따라서 시장의 반응이 이게 더블탑으로 요 단기를 봤을 때 더블탑으로 해서 더 크게 내려가는 그런 추세가 될지 반등을 할지. 그러니까 이렇게 해서 이렇게 되는 것도 있거든요. 그러면 이만큼 내려가요. 퍼웰 나왔습니다. 마이크를 올릴까요? 보죠.
Good afternoon. My colleagues and I are strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. We have both the tools we need and the resolve that it will take to restore price stability on behalf of American families and businesses. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by 0.75 percentage point, and we anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate. We are moving our policy stance purposefully to a level that will be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy has slowed from the historically high growth rates of 2021, which reflected the reopening of the economy following the pandemic recession. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production. Growth in consumer spending has slowed from last year's rapid pace, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, in large part reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment, while weaker economic growth abroad is restraining exports. As shown in our summary of economic projections, since June, FOMC participants have marked down their projections for economic activity, with the median projection for real GDP growth standing at just 0.2% this year and 1.2% next year, well below the median estimate of the longer-run normal growth rate. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market has remained extremely tight, with the unemployment rate near a 50-year low, job vacancies near historical highs, and wage growth elevated. Job gains have been robust, with employment rising by an average of 378,000 jobs per month over the last 3 months. The labor market continues to be out of balance, with demand for workers substantially exceeding the supply of available workers. The labor force participation rate showed a welcome uptick in August, but has little changed since the beginning of the year. FOMC participants expect supply and demand conditions in the labor market to come into better balance over time, easing the upward pressure on wages and prices. The median projection in the SEP for the unemployment rate rises to 4.4% at the end of next year, a half percentage point higher than in the June projections. Over the next 3 years, the median unemployment rate runs above the median estimate of its longer-run normal level. Inflation remains well above our 2% longer-run goal. Over the
우리가 PDF로 본 그 내용들 거의 잘 읽어주고 있네요.
Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.6%. In August, the 12-month change in the consumer price index was 8.3%, and the change in the core CPI was 6.3%. Price pressures remain evident across a broad range of goods and services. Although gasoline prices have turned down in recent months, they remain well above year-earlier levels, in part reflecting Russia's war against Ukraine, which has boosted prices for energy and food and has created additional upward pressure on inflation. The median projection in the SEP for total PCE inflation is 5.4% this year and falls to 2.8% next year, 2.3% in 2024, and 2% in 2025. Participants continue to see risks to inflation as weighted to the upside. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high
맥시멈
inflation
임플로이먼이랑
imposes significant
프라이스
hardship as it erodes
스테빌러리에 대한
purchasing
걸 계속 얘기하고 있어요. 그게 뭐 연준의 기본
higher costs of
목표니까.
essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 0.75 percentage point, bringing the target range to 3 to 3.25%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet, which plays an important role in firming the stance of monetary policy. Over coming months, we will be looking for compelling evidence that inflation is moving down, consistent with inflation returning to 2%. We anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be
물가는 2% 내릴 때까지 계속 하겠다. 똑같은 얘기예요.
on the incoming data and the evolving outlook for the economy. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 3 percentage points this year. At some point, as the stance of monetary policy tightens further, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive policy stance for some time.
리스트릭티브한 스탠스를 좀 길게 가져가야 된다.
As shown in the SEP, the median projection for the appropriate level of the federal funds rate is 4.4% at the end of this year, 1 percentage point higher than projected in June. The median projection rises to 4.6% at the end of next year and declines to 2.9% by the end of 2025, still above the median estimate of its longer-run value. Of course, these projections do not represent a committee decision or plan, and no one knows with any certainty where the economy will be a year or more from now. We are taking forceful and rapid steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below-trend growth, and there will very likely be some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. We will keep at it until we're confident the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
오케이. 지금 준비 연설문 다 읽었고요. 주요 내용은 75 베이시스 포인트 올리고 연말까지 4.4%, 2023년에 4.6% 정도 되는 걸 예상하고 인플레이션 2% 될 때까지 두들겨 잡겠다. 그리고 뭐가 있었죠? 자기 스탠스를 좀 오래 가져가야 된다. 그 프리머추얼 된 그런 상황에서 피벗을 하거나 그러지는 않을 것이다. 그런 얘기를 했습니다. 끝. 우리 목두님 성공했음. 어제 목두님이 라이브 하라 그래가지고 아주 머릿속에 그게 부담이 됐습니다. 지금 뭐 기자회견 중에서도 또 주가가 오르락내리락 할 거예요. 질문에 따라서. 열어놓을 테니까 계속 들으실 수 있는 분은 들으시고요. 가끔가다 제가 뭐 특이사항 있으면 한 번씩 강조점을 말씀드리겠습니다.
High inflation we're seeing, we think we'll need to, and in light of what I just said, we think that we'll need to bring our funds rate to a restrictive level and to keep it there for some time. So what will we be looking at, I guess, is your question. So we'll be looking at a few things. First, we'll want to see growth continuing to run below trend. We'll want to see movements in the labor market showing a return to a better balance between supply and demand. And ultimately, we'll want to see clear evidence that inflation is moving back down to 2%. So that's what we'll be looking for. In terms of reducing rates, I think we'd want to be very confident that inflation is moving back down to 2% before we would consider that.
Steve.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Steve Leisman, CNBC. Can you talk about how you factor in the variable lags on inflation and the extent to which the outlook for rates should be seen as linear in the sense that you keep raising rates, or can you envision a time when there's a pause to kind of look at what has been wrought in the economy from the rate increases? Thank you.
Sure. So, of course, monetary policy does famously work with long and variable lags. The way I think of it is our policy decisions affect financial conditions immediately. In fact, financial conditions have usually been affected well before we actually announce our decisions. Then changes in financial conditions begin to affect economic activity fairly quickly, within a few months. But it's likely to take some time to see the full effects of changing financial conditions on inflation. So we are very much mindful for that. And that's why I noted in my opening remarks that at some point, as the stance of policy tightens further, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of rate hikes while we assess how our cumulative policy adjustments are affecting the economy and inflation. So that's how we think about that. Your second question, sorry, was?
Is there a point in time you can see pausing? Is it linear that you keep raising rates, or is there? Oh, I'm sorry. I should know better than to not talk with my microphone.
I should know better than to answer your second question.
Oh, there you go. Is it linear? Do you keep raising rates, or is there a pause that you could envision where you kind of figure out what has happened to the economy and give time to catch up in the real economy, the rate increase time to catch up in the real economy? Thank you.
So I think it's very hard to say with precise certainty the way this is going to unfold. As I mentioned, what we think we need to do and should do is to move our policy rate to a restrictive level that's restrictive enough to bring inflation down to 2%, where we have confidence of that. And what you see in the SEP numbers is people's views as of today, as of this meeting, as to the kind of levels that will be appropriate. Now, those will evolve over time, and I think we'll just have to see how that goes. There is a possibility, certainly, that we would go to a certain level that we're confident in and stay there for a time. But we're not at that level. Clearly today, we've just moved, I think, probably into the very lowest level of what might be restrictive. And certainly in my view and in the view of the committee, there's a ways to go.
Rachel.
Hi, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from The Washington Post. Thank you for taking our questions. The projections show the unemployment rate rising to 4.4% next year. And historically, that kind of rise in the unemployment rate would typically bring a recession with it. Should we interpret that to mean no soft landing? And is that kind of rise necessary to get inflation down?
Right. So you're right. In the SEP, there's what I would characterize as a relatively modest increase in the unemployment rate from a historical perspective, given the expected decline in inflation. Now, why is that? So really, that is what we generally expect, because we see the current situation as outside of historical experience in a number of ways, and I'll mention a couple of those. First, and you know these, but first, job openings are incredibly high. relative to the number of people looking for work, it's plausible, I'll say, that job openings could come down significantly, and they need to, without as much of an increase in unemployment as has happened in earlier historical.
지금 질의응답하던 거는 해석이 지금 바로 안 되는데요. 좀 전에 질의응답하던 거, 그거는 뭐냐면은 연준이 상당히 그 자기 방향을 확실히 잡고 가는 그런 이미지를 보여줬어요. 그렇기 때문에 지금 주가가 동시에 반등하는 그런 모습을 보여주고 있는 것 같아요. 좀 이 기자가 질문한 거 좀 들어볼게요.
Beginning with the pandemic and really with the reopening of the economy, and more recently amplified and added to by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have all contributed to the sharp increase in inflation. So these are the kinds of events that are not really seen in prior business cycles. And in principle, if those things start to get better, and we do see some evidence of the beginnings of that, it's not much more than that, but it's good to see that. For example, commodity prices look like they may have peaked for now. Supply chain disruptions are beginning to resolve. Those developments, if sustained, could help ease the pressures on inflation. So,
이 기자가 질문했던 내용 중에서는 계속 이렇게 연준이 강하게 나오면서 경제를 어렵게 만들면 어떡하냐 이제 그런 얘기를 하는 거에 대해 가지고 파웰이 그 상황 얘기 해주고 있는 건데요.
modest decline, or rather increase in unemployment, and a soft landing would be very challenging. And we don't know. No one knows whether this process will lead to a recession, or if so, how significant that recession would be.
지금 얘기한 거는 소프트 랜딩이 좀 챌린징하다. 쉽진 않을 것이다. 그런 거 얘기하면서 미래에 대해서는 정확하게 아무도 예측할 수 없기 때문에
Also, do we get more labor supply, which would help as well. In addition, the chances of a soft landing are likely to diminish to the extent that policy needs to be more restrictive or restrictive for longer. Nonetheless, we're committed to getting inflation back down to 2% because we think that a failure to restore price stability would mean far greater pain later on.
Are vacancies still at the top of your list in terms of understanding the labor market and how much room there is there?
결론적으로 보면 이게 프론트 로딩이 나중에 우리가 더 겪을 고통을 줄이는 데는 도움이 된다 그런 얘기를 한 것 같아요.
That and quits are really very good ways to look at how tight the labor market is and how different it is from other cycles, where generally the unemployment rate itself is the single best indicator. We think those things have for quite a time now really added value in terms of understanding where the labor market is.
Nick.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. You said not too long ago in describing the policy destination, there's still a way to go. But I imagine you have to have some idea about how you're thinking about your destination, whether it's a stopping point or a pausing point. And so I was wondering if you could discuss how you are thinking about, as the data come in, where that destination is, how it's moving up if inflation doesn't perform as you expect. Do you want to have a policy rate that's above the underlying inflation rate, for example? And do you have an estimate for where you think the underlying inflation rate might be in the economy right now?
Well, so again, we believe that we need to raise our policy stance overall to a level that is restrictive. And by that I mean is meaningfully putting meaningful downward pressure on inflation. That's what we need to see in the stance of policy. We also know that there are long and variable lags, particularly as they relate to inflation. So it's a challenging assessment. So what do you look at? You look at broader financial conditions, as you know. You look at where rates are, real and nominal in some cases. You look at credit spreads. You look at financial conditions indexes. We also, I would think, and you see this this is something we talked about today in the meeting and talk about in all of our meetings, and you see this, I think, in the committee forecast. You want to be at a place where real rates are positive across the entire yield curve. And I think that would be the case if you look at the numbers that we're writing down and think about, you measure those against some sort of forward-looking assessment of inflation expectations. I think you would see, at that time, you'd see positive real rates across the yield curve, and that is also an important consideration.
Hi, Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thanks for the opportunity. I just want to be clear on the steps. You say it's meeting by meeting, but it sure looks like we're going 75, 50, 25. Is 75 next month the baseline?
So we make one decision per meeting, and the meeting decision we made today was to raise the federal funds rate by 75. You're right that the median for the year end suggests another 125 basis points in rate increases. But there's another fairly large group that saw 100 basis points addition to where we are today. So that would be 25 basis points less. So we're going to make that decision at the meeting. We didn't make that decision today. We didn't vote on that.
지금 질문이 내년에 연말까지 얼마나 올릴 거냐 그랬더니 150 올리는 그룹도 있었고 100 올리지 않는 그룹도 있었다. 이제 그런 얘기를 하네요.
That's what we're thinking about.
So just as a follow-up to that, I'm wondering about the sort of risk management considerations here. Given there's some discussion now of overdoing it, what's the incentive to continue front-loading right now? Is it lack of progress on inflation seen in the CPI reports, or is it a motivation to get as much done while the job market is still as strong as it is?
So what we've seen is inflation our expectation has been that we would begin to see inflation come down, largely because of supply side healing. By now, we would have thought that we would have seen some of that. We haven't. We have seen some supply side healing, but inflation has not really come down. If you look at core PCE inflation, which is a good measure of where inflation is running now, if you look at it on a 3, 6, and 12-month trailing annualized basis, you'll see that inflation is at 4.8%, 4.5%, and 4.8%. So that's a pretty good summary of where we are with inflation, and that's not where we expected or wanted to be. So what that tells us is that we need to continue, and we can keep doing these, and we did today do another large increase as we approach the level that we think we need to get to. And we're still discovering what that level is, but people are writing that down in their SEP where they think policy needs to be. So that's how we're thinking about it.
Chair Powell, how should we interpret the fact that core inflation is still not forecast in the SEP to be back to target in 2025, and yet the dot plot projects cuts as early as 2024? And does that mean there's a level of inflation above the 2% target that the Fed is willing to tolerate?
So I guess core is at 2.1 in 2025, and in the median, and headline is at 2.0. So that's pretty close. I mean, we write down our forecasts and we figure out what the median is and we publish it. So it's not. I would say that if the economy followed this path, this would be a pretty good outcome. But you're right, it is a tenth higher than 2%.
Okay, just as a quick follow-up, I mean, if the concern is that underlying inflation is becoming more entrenched, perhaps each month, then why forego the more aggressive 100 basis point increase today? And does that risk having to do more later on?
Yeah, so we, as we said, at the last press conference and in between that one and this one, we said that we would make our decision based on the overall data coming in. So if you remember, we got a surprisingly low reading in July, and then a surprisingly high reading for August. So I think you never want to overreact too much to any one data point. So if you look at them together, and as I just mentioned, if you really look at this year's inflation, 3, 6, and 12-month trailing, you see inflation is running too high. It's running 4.5% or above. You don't need to know much more than that. If that's the one thing you know that this committee is committed to getting to a meaningfully restrictive stance of policy and staying there until we feel confident that inflation is coming down. That's how we think about it.
Victoria.
Hi, Victoria Guido with Politico. I wanted to ask about the balance sheet. You all have left open the possibility that you might sell mortgage-backed securities, but we've seen significant.
MBS에 대한 질문하네요.
Wondering whether conditions there might affect your plans for how quickly you have the runoff on the MBS side?
So what we said, as you know, was that we would consider that once balance sheet runoff is well underway. I would say it's not something we're considering right now and not something I expect to be considering in the near term. It's just it's something I think we will turn to, but the time for turning to it has not come and is not close.
지금은 MBS 고려할 상황은 아니다. 뭐 그런 얘기하는 것 같아요.
Might affect that decision, but the main thing is we're not considering that decision, and I
지금
don't expect
considering
it
하고
will
있지 않다.
anytime soon.
Thanks. Neil Irwin with Axios. A number of commentators have come to the view, and including over at the World Bank, that simultaneous global tightening around the world creates a risk of a global recession that's worse than is necessary to bring inflation down. How do you see that risk? How do you think of coordination with your fellow central bankers?
지금 글로벌 리세션이랑 미국이랑의 관계, FOMC 관계에 대한 질문한 것 같아요.
So we actually, my colleagues and I, a number of my FOMC colleagues and I just got back from one of our frequent trips to Basel, Switzerland, to meet with other senior central bank officials from around the world. We are in pretty regular contact, and we exchange. Of course, we all serve a domestic mandate, domestic objectives, in our case, the dual mandate, maximum employment price stability. But we regularly discuss what we're seeing in terms of our own economy and international spillovers. And it's a very ongoing, constant kind of a process. So we are very aware of what's going on in other economies around the world and what that means for us and vice versa. The forecast that we put together, that our staff puts together and that we put together on our own, always try to take all of that into account. I mean, I can't say that we do it perfectly, but it's not as if we don't think about, the policy decisions, monetary policy and otherwise, the economic developments that are taking place in major economies that can have an effect on the U.S. economy. That is very much baked into our own forecast and our own understanding of the U.S. economy as best we can. It won't be perfect. So, I don't see it's hard to talk about collaboration in a world where people have very different levels of interest rates. If you remember, there were coordinated cuts and raises and things like that at various times. But really, we're in very different situations. But I will tell you that our contact is more or less ongoing. And it's not coordination, but there's a lot of information sharing, and we all, I think, are informed by what other important economies that are important to the United States are doing.
Craig Torres from Bloomberg. Chair Powell, you talked about some ways the higher interest rates are affecting the economy, but we've also seen a resilient labor market with durable consumption, strong corporate profits. And I'm wondering what your story is on the resilience of the economy. After all, you and your colleagues said, well, we started tightening in March when we were talking about interest rates in the future. And indeed, Treasury rates moved up. So we should have had a lot of tightening taking effect. Why is the economy, in your view, so resilient? And does it mean that we might need a possibly higher terminal rate?
지금 질문은 지금 경제가 건실하고 고용이 좋고 기업 실적이 올라간다는 그런 얘기를 하는데 거기에 대한 너의 뷰는 어떠냐? 약간 퀘셔닝 하는 것 같아요.
Rate sensitive are certainly showing the effects of our tightening. And of course, the obvious example is housing, where you see declining activity and of all different kinds and housing price increases moving down. So we're having an effect on interest-sensitive spending. I think through exchange rates, we're having an effect on exports and imports. I think so. All of that's happening. But you're right. And we've said this. This is a strong, robust economy. People have savings on their balance sheet from the period when they couldn't spend and where they were getting government transfers. There's still very significant savings out there, although not as much at the lower end of the income spectrum, but still some savings out there to support growth. The states are very flush with cash, so there's good reason to think that this will continue to be a reasonably strong economy. Now, the data sort of are showing that growth is is going to be below trend this year. We think of trend as being about 1.8% or in that range. We're forecasting growth well below that, and most forecasters are. But you're right. There's certainly a possibility that growth can be stronger than that, and that's a good thing because that means the economy will be more resistant to to a significant downturn. But of course we are focused on the thing I started with, which is getting inflation back down to 2%. We can't fail to do that. If we were to fail to do that, that would be the thing that would be most painful for the people that we serve. So for now, that has to be our overarching focus. And you.
뭐 포웰 얘기는 얘긴데 하여튼 바바는 뭐 난리 났나요 지금? 바바 뭐 풋 옵션 뭐 엄청 들어. 풋 옵션 short put option 뭐야 이거 어떻게 해석해야 돼? 바바의 옵션이 엄청 들어가고 있네요 지금. 바바에 무슨 일이 벌어지고 있나? 이거를 확대해서 보실 수 있는 분들은 확대해서 한번 보세요. 저는 확대해서 보여드릴 수 있는 방법이 없네요 여기서는. 아니야, 확대해서 볼 수 있는 방법이 있겠다. 제가 보여드릴게요. 바바에 이런 옵션들이 들어가고 있어요. 아주 이해가 안 되는. 풋을 팔았다는 거는 시큐어 풋을 할 때는 거거든요. 180보다도 안 내려갈 것이다. 155보다 안 내려갈 것이다. 160보다 바바에 뭐가 있나 봐요, 지금.
Too many people working, but the real point is this: inflation. What we hear from people when we meet with them is that they really are suffering from inflation, and if we want to set ourselves up, really light the way to another period of a very strong labor market, we have got to get inflation behind us. I wish there were a painless way to do that. There isn't. So what we need to do is get rates up to the point where we're putting meaningful downward pressure on inflation, and that's what we're doing. And we certainly don't hope. We certainly haven't given up the idea that we can have a relatively modest increase in unemployment. Nonetheless, we need to complete this task.
Well, how will you know, or will you know, if you've gone too far?
It's hard to hypothetically deal with that question. I mean, our really tight focus now continues to be ongoing rate increases to get the policy rate up where it needs to be. And as I said, you can look at this SEP as today's estimate of where we think those rates would be. Of course.
SEP가 뭐예요? 여기서 또 SEP라고 얘기하는데 SEP는 제가 모르는 축약어 같은데 SEP.
What you just mentioned about the labor market, you've said several times that to have the labor market we want, we need price stability. And you've suggested maybe there isn't a trade-off in the long run. But in the short run, there is a lot of concern, as people have been expressing here, about higher unemployment as a result of these rate hikes, or as a result of the rate hikes. So can you explain, though, what about inflation now?
아닌데 Simplify Employee Pension? 아닌데 이거 같진 않은데.
High inflation will,
아니야 이거 아니야.
lead to a weaker job market. So can you spell that out a little more for the general public and how that would work?
So for starters, people are seeing their wage increases, their wage increases eaten up by inflation. So if your family is one where you spend most of your paycheck, every paycheck cycle, on gas, food, transportation, clothing, basics of life, and prices go up the way they've been going up, you're in trouble right away. You don't have a cushion, and this is very painful for people at the lower end of the income and wealth spectrum. So that's what we're hearing from people is, very much that inflation is really hurting. So how do we get rid of inflation? And as I mentioned, it would be nice if there were, a way to just wish it away, but there isn't. We have to get supply and demand back into alignment, and the way we do that is by slowing the economy. Hopefully, we do that by slowing the economy, and we see some softening in labor market conditions, and we see a big contribution from supply side, improvements and things like that. But none of that is guaranteed. In any case, our job is to deliver price stability, and I think you can think of price stability as an asset that just delivers large benefits to society over a long period of time. We really saw that for a long time. The United States had 2% inflation, didn't move around much, and that was enormously beneficial to the public that we serve. And we have to get back to that and keep it for another long period of time. To pull back from the task of doing that is you're just postponing. The record shows that if you postpone that, the delay is only likely to lead to more pain. So, I think we're moving to do what we need to do and do our jobs.
이제 다른 질문 같은 대답이 계속 나오기 시작해요. 이제 끝날 때가 될 것 같아요.
Taking the question, Mr. Chairman. Edward Lawrence from Fox Business. So you had said that Americans and businesses need to feel some economic pain as we go forward. How long from here should Americans be prepared for that economic pain?
How long? I mean, it really depends on how long it takes for wages and more than that, prices to come down, for inflation to come down. And what you see in our projections today is that inflation moves down, significantly over the course of next year, and then more the next year after that. And I think once you're on that path, that's a good thing, and things will start to feel better to people. They'll feel lower inflation. They'll feel that the economy's improving, and also if our projections are close to right, you will see that that the costs in unemployment they're meaningful, and they're certainly very meaningful to the people who lose their jobs, and we talk about that in our meetings quite a lot. But at the same time, we'd be setting the economy up for another long period. This era has been noted for very long expansions. We've had 3 of the 4 longest in measured history since we got inflation under control, and that's not an accident. So when inflation is low and stable, you can have these 9, 10, 11, 10-year expansions, and you can see what we saw in 2018, 19, and 20, which was very low unemployment, the biggest wage gains going to people at the low end of the spectrum, the smallest racial gaps that we've seen since we started keeping track of that. So we want to get back to that, but to get there, we're going to have to get supply and demand back in alignment, and that's going to take tight monetary policy for a period of time.
As a follow-up, what is that economic pain in your mind? Is it job losses? Is it higher interest rates on credit cards? What is that economic pain?
So it's all of those things. Higher interest rates, slower growth, and a softening labor market are all painful for the public that we serve. But they're not as painful as failing to restore price stability and then having to come back and do it, down the road again, and doing it at a time when actually now people have really come to expect, high inflation. If the concept of high inflation becomes entrenched in people's economic thinking about their decisions, then sort of getting back to price stability, the cost of getting back to price stability just rises, and so we want to avoid that. We want to act aggressively now.
오케이, 지금 질문이 뭐 조금 비슷비슷 다른 질문이 나오는데 대답은 똑같아요. 아주 지겨우니까 우리 얘기하죠. 이건 또 다른 질문이에요. 약간 몰기지에 관한 질문이네요.
And housing prices are still elevated. Now, at the end of your June press conference, you mentioned plans to reset the housing market. I was wondering if you could elaborate on what you mean when you say reset and what you think it will take to actually get there.
하우징 마켓을 리셋한다 그런 표현했는데 그게 무슨 얘기인지 설명을 해달라.
Particular specific, set of data or anything. What I'm really saying is that we've had a time of a red hot housing market all over the country where, famously houses were selling to the first buyer at 10% above the ask before even seeing the house, that kind of thing. So there was a big imbalance between supply and demand. Housing prices were going up at an unsustainably fast level. So the deceleration in housing prices that we're seeing should help bring sort of prices more closely in line with rents and other housing market fundamentals. And, you know, that's a good thing. For the longer term, what we need is supply and demand to get better aligned so that housing prices go up at a reasonable level, at a reasonable pace, and that people can afford houses again. And I think we probably in the housing market have to go through a correction to get back to that place. There are also longer run issues though with the housing market, as you know, where you know it's difficult to find lots now close enough to cities and things like that. So builders are having a hard time getting zoning and lots and workers and materials and things like that. But from a sort of business cycle standpoint, this difficult correction should put the housing market back into better balance.
Shelter made up such a large part of this hot CPI report that we saw. Do you think that there is a lag and that we will see that come down in the coming months, or do you think that there's still this imbalance that needs to be addressed?
No, I think that shelter.
뭐 거기에 대한 답은 뭐 그냥 과열된 거 뭐 주택을 사기 위해서 10%보다 더 애스킹 프라이스를 내야 되고 그런 거에 대해서 해소를 하기는 거를 생각한다. 뭐 그런 얘기를 하는 거예요. 과열된 거를 좀 죽이겠다. 그런 거를 리셋이라고 표현했다. 뭐 그렇게 설명하는 것 같아요.
Okay, we'll go to Jean for the last question. Hi, Jean Young with Market News. You've talked about the need to get real rates into positive territory, and you said earlier that policy is just moving into that territory now. So I'm curious, how restrictive is rates at 4.6% expected? Is that expected to be next year? How restrictive?
So I think if you look, you know, when we get to, let's assume we do get to that level, which I think is likely, you know, what you're going to do is you're going to adjust that for some forward looking measure of inflation. And, you know, that could be, you pick your measure. It could be, you know, there are all kinds of different things you can pick and you get. But what you'll get is a positive number. In all cases, you will get forward inflation expectations in the short term, I think, that are going to be, assuming that we're doing our jobs appropriately, that will be significant. So you'll have a positive federal funds rate at that point, which could be 1% or so. But I mean, I don't know exactly what it would be, but it would be significantly positive when we get to that level. And let me say, you know, we've written down what we think is a plausible path for the federal funds rate. The path that we actually execute will be enough. It will be enough to restore price stability. So this is something that, as you can see, they've moved up, and we're going to continue to watch incoming data and the evolving outlook and ask ourselves whether our policy is in the right place as we go.
지금 마지막 질문 해서 끝냈는데요. 지금 상황이랑 주식시장 움직이는 거랑 전혀 임팩트를 줄 만한 내용은 없었어요. 그런데 지금 시장이 올라갔다 내려갔다 하는 거는 다분히 이 짧은 트레이드 구간을 만들어 본 것 같은 생각이 들거든요. 잘 지켜봐야 될 것 같아요. 조심하시기 바랍니다.
Joining us on set, as we do on these Fed days, Gary Cohn, former NEC director, former Goldman Sachs president. Market's been all over the place. What's your takeaway?
Well, I think the speech was
지금부터의 마켓 움직임이 진짜 움직임이에요. 이제부터 마켓이 어떻게 다이제스트를 하고 프라이스 액션을 보여주는지 그걸 봐야 되는 것 같은데. 일단은 수익 실현하고 수익 가고 수익 실현하고 지금 다시 한번 만들어주는 그런 패턴이거든요. 요 만들어지는 패턴이 그렇게 확실하진 않아요. 이 부분까지 올라와야 돼. 어제도 잠깐 보여드렸듯이 지난번에 이 히스토리 보면 연준 회의 끝나고 발표한 후에는 이 주가가 상승으로 마무리된 적이 많았었다. 그렇게 보니까 오늘도 지금부터 45분 남은 이 시간 동안 랠리를 일으켜서 한 3,900까지 안착하는 그런 흐름이 보여진다 그러면 뭐 오늘도 성공한 하루가 되지 않을까 싶습니다.
Because we know there's a lag effect.
Did we get an answer on that?
I don't think we did. Well, I'm sure Steve will tell us if he thinks he got an answer or not.
Yeah, we're going to talk to Steve here in a minute. Look, Gary, actually, we've got him. Senior economics reporter Steve Leisman, who just mentioned in the room there. Ask that question, Steve. What did you take away?
You know, Gary's got it exactly right to focus on that, I think. We did get something of an answer. It was a bit like I'll kind of know. Well, let's just listen to what he said. This was in response to, is it possible you might get to a place where you feel like you have to pause and see what impact Fed rate increases have on the economy? Here's what he said.
There is a possibility, certainly, that we would go to a certain level that we're confident in and stay there for a time. But we're not at that level. Clearly, today we've just moved, I think, probably into the very lowest level of what might be restrictive. And certainly, in my view and in the view of the committee, there's a ways to go.
Now, it's very important, Sarah, I think, to understand that one of the very last things that Chair Powell said was that the committee has this 4.6% funds rate in for next year. And he said something along the lines of, and I think it's pretty likely we're going to get there. So that's what I was saying, that Gary is spot on in looking at the totality of rate hikes that are coming. I think it's 300 basis points in a year, and I think they've done, in terms of what's happened to the 2-year, and 100 basis points in just the last month or so, which I don't know how the treasurers at places like where Gary used to work are dealing with that. It's got to be something inside the financial system right now. But this idea that they indeed will get, and the chair seems to support going to that high level, which, as I said earlier, he's out-hawked the hawks here relative to where the market was going into this. The Fed is above where the market is for next year and the year after that.
Absolutely, and you see that in the two-year
지금
no yield. Just want to point that out for everyone.
시장은 뭐 환호도 아니고 걱정도 아니고 그냥 제자리네요. 이러다가 정말로 L 쉐입으로 시장이 갈 수도 있겠다는 생각이 조금 드네요. L 쉐입, L자로 가는 거죠. 쭉 떨어졌잖아요. 그 다음에 반등 없이 몇 달을 제자리로 가는 거죠. 뭐 여기서 물론 이렇게 움직임은 있겠지만 이거를 기대하시면은 이런 게 아니고 이런 식으로
Products are expensive when you're buying it in foreign currency.
But we do import a lot, and it helps.
We do.
Certainly, it also puts pressure on inflation, which we're trying to do. I think the other problem is it wreaks havoc around the world.
It does.
And it makes you wonder at what point. It seems like everyone's kind of cool with it right now, but there's a question of whether are we going to see some sort of intervention? Are we going to see some sort of Plaza Accord? When you get to these levels, you have to wonder.
Well, it surely would be helpful if we saw other major
L 쉐입 되면은 최악이죠.
religion that the Fed has right now and start raising their interest rates. We've got major central banks around the world.
뭔가 방향성이 확실하면은 아래로 가든 위로 가든 돈을 벌지만 L 쉐입으로 가면은 돈 벌기 힘들어요.
In short duration treasuries, 2-year treasuries.
But we have better growth.
You can earn in 6-month treasuries, and you can be long the dollar and versus what you can in your own country. You know, people are going to buy the dollar. You know, so we're going to continue to see stronger and stronger dollars as currency migrates to the carry trade here in this country.
Gary, hang on. We're going to come back on the other side of the break. Gary Cohn, of course, former NEC director. I just want to show you a live look at the S&P 500 sector heat map. Just a moment ago, every sector was stronger, and we've given up some of the gains, as you can see. Consumer staples hanging on. General Mills had a really good quarter. We'll talk about that stock at a record high. Technology stays green. So does industrials. Everything else turns red, though, on the day. Nothing extreme, but as I said, it's been a really volatile and choppy trade post-Fed. We're going to have much more reaction to what we heard from Fed Chair Jay Powell with Gary Cohn and others right after the break.
지금 흐름이 다시 다 불구적적하게 바뀌어버렸네요. 흐름이 불구적적하게 바뀌어버리고 특별한 프라이스 액션도 없고 그러니까 이제는 정말로 마치도록 하겠습니다. 다들 들어가시고요. 우리 회원님들은 디스코드에서 치챗 나누도록 하죠.